Thank you for listening to the John Calvin podcast. For early access, bonus episodes, and a range of community benefits, sign up at johncalvinpod.com/support. That's johncalvinpod.com/support. I say nothing of fire and sword, and exiles, and all the furious attacks of our enemies. I say nothing of slanders and other such vexations. How many things there are within that are far worse. Ambitious men openly attack us. Epicureans and Lucianists mock at us. Impudent men insult us. Hypocrites rage at us. Those who are wise after the flesh do us harm. Indirectly, and we are harassed in many different ways on every side. It is in short a great miracle that, weighed down by the burden of such a heavy and dangerous office, any one of us should persevere. Well, that is, of course, John Calvin talking about the volcanic events that characterized his time as the pastor of Geneva. The years that we're looking at today are very much the years Calvin is most famous for. So as we were saying in the last episode, he spent 3 very happy years in Strasbourg, getting married, getting mentored by Martin Bucer, getting pastoral experience. And then, because of various political and religious tensions in Geneva, they asked Calvin to come and be the pastor of Geneva again. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the fascinating time that Calvin spends in Geneva. This is going to be quite fast-moving, but rest assured, many of the major incidents of Calvin's life will have future episodes focusing on just them specifically and getting into more detail. But for today, we're going to be moving quite quickly, so don't fear, it's on its way in due course. And for our amazing members, you can actually binge listen to any of these series through early access rather than having to wait for each episode every week, and you can do that at johncalvinpod.com/support. So anyway, in September 1541, Calvin is back in Geneva. Calvin has managed to strike a deal that he will come back to Geneva only if they let him establish a process of discipline and reform, which the city authorities agree to in principle. However, as we will see, Calvin's Geneva years are far from straightforward for him, and throughout the 1540s, he has a number of big bust-ups with the city council, which are fascinating, entertaining, really interesting to get into. So the Genevans and the city council especially are very sensitive to their independence as a city. They know that the only reason they have independence is because of their military dependence on the Swiss Confederation. But the city council are cautious about foreign influences taking away their independence and power, and so they restrict citizenship, along with the ability to vote or hold office to locally born people. And by doing this, Calvin is effectively excluded from the political levers of power. As a Frenchman, he can't vote and he can't stand for office. So this popular perception that Calvin was the dictator of Geneva is not historically accurate. What Calvin does have is his preaching and his program of reform. And he is an exceptional preacher. He preaches completely without notes for about an hour. We'll be having future episodes looking much closer at Calvin as a preacher, but Calvin preaches over 2,000 sermons. And even when he's sick and weak and near the end of his life, he asks to be carried into the pulpit. Such was the supreme importance that Calvin attaches to preaching the Word of God. He also writes verse-by-verse commentaries on pretty much the whole Bible except Revelation. And the quality of Calvin's insights, his ability to summarize and apply a text, is next to none, in my opinion. If any preachers are listening to me, go and read Calvin's commentaries. They are brilliant. But Calvin arrives in Geneva, and he immediately draws up this program for reforming the church called the Ecclesiastical Ordinances, including, very famously, the creation of the consistory. So Calvin wants a well-ordered, well-structured church according to Scripture, and so he creates the consistory in 1542, and they are a bit like the moral police, although that's quite harsh to describe them that way, but it gives you a picture of what they're there to do. It was a mixture of 12 lay elders and 9 pastors. And basically, the consistory meet every Thursday to enforce church discipline. Calvin thinks that his ordinances are perfectly clear, that the right to excommunicate and to make decisions for the church more generally only lies with the consistory and not with the political powers, that is the city council. But as we'll see, this will become an issue of huge tension and really explosive disagreement as Calvin's career goes on, because increasingly the city council don't want to surrender their hard-won power and independence to anyone, least of all a Frenchman without proper citizenship. So right now, Geneva is in such a bad state that they accept Calvin's ordinances and the creation of the consistory. We'll look at the consistory in future episodes in more detail because, again, it is so interesting and shocking and funny at times too. But the one thing I want to say is that I think the consistory gets quite a harsh press. So there's quite a few people who present the consistory in Calvin's Geneva as a bit like the Taliban or something like that. And to be sure, some of the changes Calvin institutes are perceived by some in Geneva as extremely oppressive, but the consistory actually gets involved in a lot of really good stuff as well that often gets lost in the controversy surrounding him. So there's cases of domestic abuse where the consistory come in and actually intervene to stop it happening. There's cases where they intervene on behalf of the vulnerable or the poor. There are, of course, interventions which are very much of their time and are quite uncomfortable to read, but it's not a uniform picture, and this is the early modern period in which discipline is a huge issue across the whole of Christendom, so not just Geneva or Calvin. And Calvin goes on to change the worship in Geneva, so he copies his mentor Martin Bucer's liturgy in Strasbourg and borrows his approach to congregational singing of the Psalms as well. To the extent that when John Knox visits Geneva many years after this, when Calvin's reforms are much more established, he describes Geneva as the most perfect school of Christ that ever was on earth since the day of the apostles. So the degree to which Geneva is a great place to be or an oppressive place seems to be an open debate. I think it's safe to say that by early modern standards, Geneva is actually quite a good place to be, I think. The poor are looked after by deacons following Calvin's instructions. Calvin very much sees financial profit as being something that should be used for the good of others, so Geneva introduces taxes on various things to try to make that happen. Under Calvin's influence, Geneva becomes a safe haven for people fleeing religious persecution of various kinds. They don't have to be Protestant. Calvin's very clear that Christians have an obligation to provide help for people fleeing persecution and the homeless. The constant thorn in Calvin's side in this period are a group called the Libertines, who are not necessarily opposed to the Reformation, but who hate Calvin's program of discipline enforced by the consistory. This wealthy and disaffected group is headed up by a chap called Ami Perrat, and they want to argue that the right to excommunicate and to enforce discipline is held ultimately by the city council, not the consistory. The consistory can admonish, they can recommend, but for Perrat, they can't coerce. Only the city council has that power. And as a result, there are a number of massive showdowns between him and Calvin as the years go by. So on one occasion, he tries to get someone who's been excommunicated for unrepentant sin, admitted to communion. Calvin preaches the sermon, the prayers are said, and then Calvin allegedly cries out, "These hands you may crush, these arms you may lop off, my life you may take, my blood is yours, you may shed it, but you shall never force me to give holy things to the profaned and dishonour the table of my God." So if you can imagine how tense the atmosphere must have been in the church in those kind of moments, it gives you an idea of the kind of tensions that there are in Geneva at this time. And throughout the 1540s, Calvin is fighting a number of battles related to this issue of the right to excommunicate. and he often loses those debates. So Perrat gets more influence, more people sympathetic to his cause get into the politics of Geneva, and for a while they're able to stand in the way of some of the things that Calvin wants to do, much to his annoyance. But things change very quickly and decisively for Calvin in 1555. And this is because by this point, Geneva has become filled with refugees who are often evangelicals fleeing religious persecution, most from France, but also from further afield. So Alistair McGrath, in his biography of Calvin, shows that in 1550, the population of Geneva is around 13,100 people, but by 1560, it's 21,400. The city council soon realised that quite a few of these refugees are actually quite rich. So there's printers, there's merchants, lawyers, and the city council decide that in exchange for a pretty hefty fee, these wealthy refugees should be granted a bourgeois status, allowing them, crucially for Calvin, to vote in Genevan elections. And this is the game changer for Calvin, where the levers of power really do begin to switch. Very quickly, by 1556, Calvin's friends, who are essentially wealthy Frenchmen, are now in charge of Geneva. And from this point on, Calvin's life is a lot less fraught. There are still resentments. He still has a lot of health problems, but in large part, the city council tend to do what Calvin recommends. Geneva and Calvin, by this point, are now massively famous, and people all over Europe see Geneva as this shining example of what a Protestant republic can be. He goes on writing his commentaries on the Bible. He revises and massively expands his magnum opus, the Institutes of the Christian Religion, into the form that we now have today. He dies in 1564 at 54 years old, so quite young. He asks, very humbly, to be buried in an unmarked grave. And he does this because he wants to avoid any kind of personality cult around him. And you do get this sense with Calvin that despite his flaws, he really does believe that this is not all about him. This is about God's will as he sees it, and God's work, and that being the decisive thing people remember about him. And so they are true to his request, and they bury him in an unmarked grave. After his death, quite a few of his enemies and people who resent him in different ways publish a bunch of negative but largely historically inaccurate biographies of Calvin, basically that try to discredit him as a tyrant, a dictator, a bloodthirsty man. And this is unfortunately, I think, where some of the popular perceptions of Calvin, that he was a dictator or a dry and detached academic or, not a nice person, basically, this is where they ultimately stem from. Part of the trouble with assessing Calvin today is that there are over 500 years of people either hating him or valorizing him, and therefore getting through to discover the real Calvin behind, as it were, these presentations of him is extremely tricky. Personally, I don't think Calvin should be hated or valorized in an unthinking way. He achieves some truly unique and admirable things, but he's also too flawed to be really valorized as well. And he would be the first to say this as well, because he has this doctrine of original sin that all human beings fall short because of this inbuilt resistance to God's ways stemming from the fall of Adam and Eve. So he would want us, I think, to learn from his life, but I don't think he would want to be hero worshipped. And the fact that he asks to be buried, in an unmarked grave really shows that. This has been a very brief introduction to Calvin's life. I hope that you've enjoyed it. We've got a myth versus reality series coming soon, which is going to look in more detail at common perceptions of Calvin to see how accurate or not they are. We've got a showdown series coming, which is going to look at the people Calvin engaged in debate and setting those conversations in historical and theological context. We've got a whole series looking in real detail at the infamous Servetus episode in Geneva, the humanist thinker who was very unfortunately burned at the stake in Calvin's Geneva and has for many people permanently tarnished Calvin's reputation. We're going to have a fun episode looking at Calvin's best ever insults, because he could be pretty devastating and funny in his insults. So I'm really looking forward to all of that. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next week for some more John Calvin.